bloggers, it's Kara from My Hood Society, and today we're going to show you how to create a Lightroom preset for your blog images. So Lightroom can do a ton of things. It's obviously made for professional photography, but we just kind of wanted to do a quick overview for how you can make presets for your blog images that aren't too involved but help you kind of establish an aesthetic and kind of up-level your game from using just other presets or phone apps. They let you have a lot more control. So I'm going to walk you through my kind of 4 categories of the settings and kind of the different settings you're going to want to play around with to establish your aesthetic, and then how you can save those as a preset. So if you go over here, you can see that I have a bunch of presets. I do professional photography, so I have obviously a ton of different ones. As a blogger, I think you're probably shooting to create 3 to 5 presets that work together and look good together. Examples might be a preset for your outfit shoots, and then a different preset for your flat lays. So kind of different presets for different lighting and how you want things to look. Maybe you want your flat lays to look a lot more contrasted, but that same kind of contrast on an outfit picture would make your skin look weird, or it'd be just a little too much. So that's kind of why you'd want to have multiple presets, but I would say 3 to 5 is kind of a good range. So let's kind of start with the 4 categories of settings. I'll just kind of go over briefly the steps that I use when I'm creating my photos for my blog. So portraits and my professional photography also is way more involved. I use Photoshop. There's so many more steps, but for my blog, I like to keep it simple, and I like to just kind of adjust the lighting, the temperature, clarity, saturation for the most part. I don't do a ton of crazy editing. So the first thing you want to look at is the exposure and the contrast. So this essentially is how light or dark your photo is for exposure, and then contrast is kind of how much it pops. So like you can see, I've already turned the exposure up to 2. When I originally shot this image, we did it really dark. The reason for this is because it was low light, so I wanted to have my shutter speed be a lot faster so I wouldn't be blurry. And by turning down my shutter speed, it didn't let as much light in, so the picture's a bit dark. But then I can just come right in and lighten it up to the kind of regular exposure that I want it to be. So this is kind of how you play around with, if you want your photos bright and airy, you're going to use positive numbers. If you want them a little bit darker, you can use negative numbers or keep it at 0. Then the contrast is kind of how bright the brights are and dark the darks are, if that makes sense. So I usually pop mine up to about 15 for all my images. I like a little bit of contrast, but not too much. You can kind of see if I go to 0, it takes away a little bit of a contrast, and then if I go to, say, let's try negative 25, you can see how the image as I go negative is becoming kind of flatter. There's less dark areas, it's kind of more, and less light areas, it's kind of a flatter image. So I usually like to keep it at 15. I like my images to look fairly contrasted, and so 15 is kind of a good number for that. One more thing before we move on to the next. As far as exposure and contrast, if you do like that bright and airy look, my other trick is to pop up your whites. So you can see this is how the photo was initially, and then if I step up my whites a little bit, it just kind of adds an extra layer of bright and airiness. So my normal setting that I like to use for this is about 30. But if I have a ton of white in my image, I won't pop it up that high, because if you brighten your whites too much, and if there's a lot of white, you tend to lose detail. So like say you were shooting on like a marble background, if you pop up your whites too much, you'll start to lose some of the detail of the marble and the detail of some of the grays, and it starts to look like a little bit too fake. So whites and blacks are basically a more advanced version of contrast. There's a little bit more nuance to them, but if you're not a professional photographer, you don't necessarily need to know all the ins and outs of how they're different. Just know that you can pop up your whites to add a little bit more brightness, a little bit more airiness, and then you can drop your blacks a little bit to add a little bit more of that contrast. The nice thing about this is that you're not doing contrast all at once, so it's not making the range of both lights and darks bigger, you can do either or. Okay, so that's the pretty much the important parts for exposure and contrast. The next thing is white balance. So white balance is up here. It's made of temperature and tint. So temperature is just the scale from blues to yellows. Tint is from greens to pinks. So the one you're probably going to want to most pay attention to is your temperature. So that's basically how golden and sunny your image looks, or how like kind of cold it looks. So I usually like mine to be on kind of the colder side. Like this is kind of what I like my image to look like, maybe even a little bit more blue. So like 5400 to 5600 is kind of my like range. But then I know people that like theirs to be a lot more yellow, a lot more golden, and it kind of has that more vintagey feel to it. I know CJ kind of prefers this style where it's very golden, it's very like warm and sunshiny. So the numbers can kind of get confusing if you're just starting. It is a Kelvin scale, which is like light temperature. All you really need to know is that 5600 is the approximate like regular daylight number for as far as the Kelvin scale goes. So if you want your images to look pretty straightforward, pretty normal, 56 is probably where you're going to want to start, and then you can just bump it up a little bit, up and down from there, play around with it. Tint is kind of more, it has more to do with when you're shooting indoors for the most part, because blue and pink isn't going to be an issue outside on most days. But like, let's say you're shooting with fluorescent lights, those tend to be like very strange and green. And so your image might look pretty green and pretty distorted. But then when you get it into Lightroom, you can kind of pop up on the pink side to kind of even that green out and make it go away. So for your normal preset, I wouldn't do anything with this. I would wait till you apply your preset to your image and then see if there needs to be any changes. I don't think you really need to mess with that for a preset. Okay, so then the third thing is clarity and sharpness. Your clarity is right here. My normal thing I like to do is pop it up to 15. So in some images, this can look strange. Like you can see with this image, I'm not sure that I like 15. It's like a little bit strong. You can see, so here's 0. Here's when I pop it up to 15. It's just a little bit too contrasted for me. So I'm going to take this back down to 10. We'll try 8. So 8 looks pretty good to me. So what's happening is, let me see if I can zoom in on an area. So here's 8. Let's take it up to 25. So you can see it adds, it's like similar to sharpness, but it's a little bit more nuanced. So you kind of use these together. For the most part, your images will be sharpening themselves. Like your settings should automatically sharpen. And 25 is a pretty good number for that. So as long as you have it set to where when you upload your image, it's going to sharpen it a little bit, then all you have to really do is mess around with your clarity and see where you want that to sit. And you can kind of see like a little bit of grain, almost looks like dots. It's like kind of grainy. And you can see if you go too far, it kind of accentuates that graininess. So you kind of want to keep it in the range of probably 5 to 15 is good. And the reason I don't go over 15 is because skin tends to start looking really, really strange if you go over 15. Like, let me try to show you my face. Whatever it went. Okay. Yeah, so let's pop it up to 25, 40, 60. If you go up too high, it kind of makes your skin look like dry and unnatural. I don't even know how to explain it, but it doesn't look great. So 5 to 15 is probably your good range for that. Yeah, and then the sharpness, again, is 25 is probably a good number, and it gives you this little box, and this is showing you the grain of the image. So if you go too sharp, the image, see how it gets really, really grainy and really kind of speckled? You want to make sure that there's not that grain. So for this image, because it was kind of dark, even 25 is a little bit grainy. So I'm going to pop it down to 18, and I kind of like that better. Okay, the next category, actually our last category, is saturation. So saturation is just how vibrant you want your image to be. So if you like the pastel look, the very light look, you can actually turn your saturation and vibrance down and make it a little more muted. If you like it to be very, very bright, very colorful, you can turn it up. So the main difference between vibrance and saturation is vibrance kind of protects skin tone. So like if I put this up to 50, you can see that like the colors get a lot brighter in my image, but my skin doesn't look strange, it doesn't turn orange. Whereas with saturation, if I were to pop that up to 50, you can see my skin gets really orange. It looks like a bad spray tan, and that's not what we want. So with saturation, probably between 5 and 10 is good. And that kind of protects your skin tone, but it does really brighten those colors a little bit more than vibrance does. With vibrance, I usually pop mine up to 25. I like very saturated, very colorful photos. I am, after all, a color and prints enthusiast, so I like my bright colors, so I usually pop that up to 25. I would say if you're new to it or you feel like your skin tones are being turned orange, I would just play around with vibrance instead of saturation. And then kind of an advanced tip is like, let's say I did want to use saturation instead. Pop it up to 30. My skin's a little bit orange. What I can do is scroll down here to the saturation sliders and just pull the orange down a little bit. So that's going to kind of fix the oranginess of my skin, but it's going to keep all of the other colors really bright and saturated. Okay, so those are the main 4 categories: is the exposure and contrast, the white balance, the clarity and sharpness, and then the saturation. Changing those and playing around with those is what's going to help you establish your aesthetic. And what I really recommend is if you have images that you know you really like, pull them up next to the image you're trying to edit and try to see if you can figure out why you like the image. And kind of assess each category. Like look at the exposure, try to set your image to the same exposure and contrast. Then clarity and sharpness, white balance, saturation, kind of go through each category and try to match your image to that image. And then you can kind of develop your aesthetic and see how your image looks compared to that one and kind of try to mimic the aesthetic you already know you like. Okay, so now we finished our settings. Let's say we are good to go. I like this picture. I'm going to add it as a preset. So you just go over to presets, you hit plus, you can name your preset. So I could call this one outfit shoot, and it's going to save in the user presets folder. Down here is where I'm able to check all of the settings that I want it to save. So like lens corrections, I didn't even make any edits there. These are all my color, saturation, and my saturation and vibrance settings, and then my exposure, contrast, blacks and whites, clarity, and sharpening. So that's pretty much what you need to leave checked, is anything you changed over here. But if you didn't change something and you leave it checked, it's not going to really affect it. So then you just want to hit create, and it's going to immediately add it right over there. Seriously, so simple. But let's just talk about like kind of a regular base preset, what you would want to do. You probably would not want to mess with your exposure unless you like your images pretty bright and you want to make sure to brighten every single image that you take. So an example of this is normally if I shoot an image kind of regular tone, I usually bump it up to at least 0.5 because I do like my images on the brighter side. So here the image was shot really dark, so I needed to bump it up a lot more to like a whole 2 stops. But if you want a bright image, 0.5 is probably a good place to start. And the other thing to remember is your preset is just your base. Like if you put your preset on and then it is way too dark or way too light, you can still go back in and specifically change each setting that you need to. It's just your kind of base to give you a slate where you know all your images are going to be pretty similar settings. So then for whites, I usually do 30 because I like them bright and airy. Clarity, I would just kind of go through and edit kind of a couple images and see kind of the average settings you use or the settings you use on each image, and then kind of save those as your preset. So anyway, I hope this was super helpful. If you have any questions at all, be sure to let us know. We're happy to help. But we just wanted to give you an overview of an easy way to do presets for blog photos, and so you don't have to go buy them, because why buy it when you can define your aesthetic yourself and really just customize it to exactly how you want your photos to look. So let us know what questions you have, and we'll see you next time.